My name is Rebecca Morrison, and I need to tell you about the 6 months I spent being gaslit and mocked by my husband for suspecting infidelity, only to discover that the truth was so much worse than an affair could ever be. This is a story about dismissal and manipulation, about financial betrayal hidden behind cruelty, about the moment when carefully maintained lies collapse under the weight of documented evidence, and about discovering that sometimes the person sleeping beside you every night is someone you never really knew at all. If you want to know what those bank records revealed and how my husband's mockery turned to panic when the truth came out, hit that like button and subscribe now. Comment below about a time the truth vindicated you. This story will shock you. Let's begin. I'd been married to David Morrison for 14 years when I found the Panties. We'd met in our mid-20s, both working at the same pharmaceutical company in New Jersey, me in regulatory compliance and David in sales. Our courtship had been conventional and comfortable: dinners, movies, weekend trips to the beach. We married when I was 28 and he was 30, bought a house in the suburbs, had 2 children who were now 11 and 8, and built what looked from the outside like a perfectly normal middle-class American life. David was a successful pharmaceutical sales representative, charismatic and personable in the way that makes for effective salespeople. He traveled frequently for work, attending medical conferences and visiting doctors' offices across the Northeast. His income was solid with good commission potential, and combined with my compliance officer salary, we lived comfortably, if not extravagantly. We took modest vacations, saved for the kids' college funds, and generally managed our finances responsibly. Or so I thought. The Panties appeared on a Tuesday morning in late September. I was doing laundry, sorting through the basket of clothes David had brought back from a 3-day conference in Philadelphia. As I pulled items out to load into the washing machine, a pair of women's underwear fell onto the floor. Black lace, expensive looking, definitely not mine. I wore practical cotton underwear from department stores, not delicate lace pieces that probably cost more than my entire weekly grocery budget. My first reaction was confusion more than anger. I stood there holding these unfamiliar panties, trying to construct an innocent explanation for how they'd ended up in my husband's luggage. Maybe they'd gotten mixed up at the hotel laundry service? Maybe someone else's belongings had accidentally been put in his bag. There had to be a reasonable explanation that didn't involve David having an affair. But even as I tried to convince myself of innocent possibilities, I knew. Deep in my gut, I knew. These panties weren't there by accident. David had been traveling more frequently over the past year, staying out later when he was home, being more secretive with his phone. I'd noticed these changes but had dismissed my suspicions as paranoia, the kind of insecurity that comes from being a 42-year-old mother of 2 who'd gained weight and lost the effortless attractiveness of youth. I decided to confront him directly. That evening, after the kids were in bed, I held up the Panties and asked simply, "Can you explain these?" David's reaction was not what I expected. Instead of shock or guilt or defensive explanations, he laughed. Actually laughed, a dismissive sound that made me feel immediately foolish. "Are you serious right now?" he said, still chuckling. "You think those are evidence of what? An affair?" "They're not mine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They were in your luggage from Philadelphia. How did they get there?" "Jesus, Rebecca. They're probably from the hotel laundry. Or maybe they fell out of someone else's bag at the airport. You really think I'm stupid enough to bring another woman's underwear home in my suitcase if I was cheating?" The logic was sound enough to create doubt. Would someone actually be that careless? "I just want to understand how they got there," I said. "I don't know how they got there, but I can tell you how they didn't get there. They didn't get there because I'm having an affair." The fact that you immediately jumped to that conclusion says more about your insecurity than it does about my behavior. He'd turned it around on me somehow, made my reasonable question into evidence of my unreasonable paranoia. "I'm not being insecure," I protested. "I found another woman's underwear in your belongings. That's not nothing. It's also not proof of anything except that laundry sometimes gets mixed up or bags accidentally touch each other. But instead of thinking logically, you immediately assume the worst about me. That's what insecurity looks like, Rebecca." We argued for another 20 minutes, but David maintained his position. The Panties were there through some innocent mishap, and my suspicion of infidelity revealed my own jealousy and paranoia rather than any actual wrongdoing on his part. By the end of the conversation, I felt small and foolish, questioning my own judgment about what had seemed like clear evidence just an hour earlier. The next day, David told the story at a dinner party we attended with 2 other couples from our social circle. He framed it as a funny anecdote about his paranoid wife finding random panties in his luggage and immediately assuming an affair. "Can you believe it?" he said, laughing as he told the story. "Hotel laundry probably mixed up someone's stuff with mine, and Rebecca immediately thinks I'm cheating. I told her if I was actually having an affair, I'd be smart enough not to bring evidence home in my suitcase." Everyone laughed, including the other wives who sympathized with David's predicament of having an overly suspicious spouse. I sat there feeling humiliated, my genuine concern reframed as neurotic jealousy, my reasonable questions mocked as evidence of insecurity. "You have to trust your husband," one of the other wives told me later in the kitchen. "Men hate feeling like we don't believe them. David seems so hurt that you'd think he'd cheat." I apologized to David that night, convinced by his reaction and the social pressure that I'd overreacted to something innocent. He accepted my apology magnanimously, telling me he understood that insecurity sometimes made people see problems that weren't really there. But something nagged at me. The dismissiveness of his reaction, the quickness to mock and humiliate rather than reassure, the way he'd weaponized my concern into a funny story about his paranoid wife. None of it felt quite right, even though I couldn't articulate exactly why. So I started paying more attention, not in obvious ways that David would notice, but quietly observing patterns in his behavior and our finances that I'd previously ignored or rationalized. I noticed that David's work travel had increased significantly over the past year. He'd always traveled, but it used to be maybe twice a month for a night or 2. Now he was gone at least weekly, sometimes for 3 or 4 nights at a time. When I mentioned this, he explained that his territory had expanded, and pharmaceutical companies were requiring more face time with doctors given increased competition. I noticed that David had become more careful with his phone, keeping it face down constantly, taking it with him even to the bathroom, password protecting it when he'd never bothered before. When I commented on this, he said it was company policy for protecting confidential client information, rolling his eyes at my implication of anything suspicious. I noticed that our joint checking account, which we'd always used for household expenses and regular bills, seemed to have less money in it than I expected given our incomes. When I asked David about this, he explained that he'd increased his 401k contributions for better retirement planning, and that some of his commission payments were being deposited into a separate account temporarily for tax purposes. Individually, none of these things were necessarily suspicious, but collectively, they formed a pattern that my gut told me meant something was wrong. The problem was that David had successfully established a narrative where my suspicions were evidence of my own neurosis rather than his actual behavior, making it nearly impossible to raise concerns without seeming paranoid. Then I found the second pair of panties. This time they were tucked into the pocket of a suit jacket David had asked me to take to the dry cleaner. Red lace, also expensive, also definitely not mine. I stared at them for a long moment, my hands actually shaking with the surge of vindication and dread. I confronted David that evening, holding up the panties. "These were in your suit jacket pocket. Explain." David looked at them, then at me, and again his reaction was not guilt or defensiveness, but amused exasperation. "Are you kidding me right now? You found more random underwear and you're doing this again?" "They were in your pocket, David. Not mixed up in laundry. In your pocket. I have no idea how they got there. Maybe as a prank? You know the guys I work with like to mess around. Or maybe they fell out of someone's bag at a conference, and I picked them up thinking they were a napkin or something and shoved them in my pocket. I honestly don't know, Rebecca, but I'm getting really tired of being accused every time you find a stray piece of clothing. This is the second time in a month. That's not coincidence. Or it's exactly coincidence. Random things happen, laundry gets mixed up, items get in the wrong places. But you're so desperate to believe I'm cheating that you interpret every coincidence as proof of an affair. I'm not desperate to believe anything, I said, my voice rising with frustration. I'm trying to understand why I keep finding other women's underwear connected to you. And I'm trying to understand why my wife doesn't trust me after 14 years of marriage. I've never given you any actual reason to suspect infidelity. I've been faithful to you since the day we met, but apparently that doesn't matter because you've decided that misplaced laundry is more credible than 14 years of loyalty. Again, he'd flipped it. My evidence became my paranoia. My questions became my failure to trust. My reasonable concerns became my unreasonable insecurity. This time, David told the story at his office, according to a colleague's wife who pulled me aside at a company event a week later. David mentioned you've been struggling with some jealousy issues, she said sympathetically. Men can be so clueless about how their travel affects their wives, but David is such a devoted family man. I'm sure once you work through your insecurity, you'll feel better about everything. I was being gaslit on multiple levels, by David directly through his dismissals and mockery, and by our social circle who'd accepted his narrative that I was an insecure wife imagining problems that didn't exist. Even my own sister, when I confided in her about the Panties, suggested I might be manufacturing crisis in my marriage because I was bored or unhappy. Sometimes when we're not fulfilled in our own lives, we create drama to give ourselves purpose, she said gently. Maybe focus on your own happiness instead of inventing reasons to doubt David. I started to genuinely question my own sanity. Was I being paranoid? Was I seeing infidelity where there were only innocent coincidences? Was my insecurity creating problems in a marriage that was actually fine? But then I remembered something my father had told me years ago, before he died. When someone is lying to you, they'll try to make you doubt your own perceptions. Trust your gut, even when everyone else tells you you're wrong. So I decided to stop confronting David and start documenting instead. I would watch and gather information quietly, building a case based on evidence rather than engaging in conversations where he could dismiss and manipulate me. I started with our finances, which I'd always mostly left to David to manage beyond my contributions to our joint account and my own retirement savings. I requested access to David's individual bank account statements, telling him I needed them for updating our household budget spreadsheet. He was reluctant, but eventually gave me login credentials after I persisted. What I found in those statements was alarming, though not in the way I'd expected. There were no charges to hotels or restaurants that would suggest affair-related expenses. Instead, there were regular large withdrawals, cash withdrawals ranging from $500 to $2,000, happening 2 or 3 times per week, totaling thousands of dollars monthly. When I asked David about these cash withdrawals, he had ready explanations. Client entertainment, he said. A lot of doctors prefer cash transactions for dinner meetings to avoid paper trails with their hospitals. It's standard practice in pharmaceutical sales. But you're withdrawing thousands of dollars weekly, I pressed. That seems excessive even for entertainment expenses. You don't understand the industry, David said dismissively. Building relationships with high-prescribing doctors requires significant investment. The company reimburses most of it, but I have to front the costs. If you'd ever worked in sales, you'd understand this is completely normal. I didn't have sales experience, so I couldn't definitively argue with this explanation, but something felt off about the amounts and frequency. I started documenting every withdrawal, date, amount, location of the ATM used. I also started checking our credit card statements more carefully. Most charges were legitimate and explainable: gas, groceries, kids' activities, normal household expenses. But there were occasional charges that seemed odd. Jewelry stores I'd never received jewelry from. Expensive restaurants on dates when David was supposedly at work dinners. Hotel charges in our own city when David was allegedly working late at the office. When I asked about these, David always had explanations. The jewelry was gifts for important clients' spouses. The restaurants were work celebrations he'd forgotten to mention. The local hotel charges were for conferences or meetings that required a professional venue with the expense billed to his credit card for later company reimbursement. Every explanation was plausible in isolation, but collectively, they were creating a picture of financial activity that didn't align with the life I thought we were living. I needed more concrete evidence, something David couldn't explain away. So I did something I'd never imagined doing. I hired a private investigator. I found one through a discreet online search, a woman named Patricia Chen who specialized in marital investigations. I met with her during my lunch break at work, paying her retainer with money I'd saved from my own checking account. I need you to follow my husband during his next business trip, I told Patricia. Document where he goes, who he meets, what he does. I need to know if he's having an affair. Patricia was professional and non-judgmental. I'll need his travel schedule and any relevant information about his typical patterns. And I should tell you, in about 60% of cases, the spouse's suspicions are confirmed. In 40%, there's an innocent explanation for the concerning behavior. Are you prepared for either outcome? I just need to know the truth, I said. Whatever it is. David's next trip was to a medical conference in Boston, scheduled for 3 days the following week. I gave Patricia his itinerary and hotel information. She would follow him from the moment he left our house until he returned, documenting everything. Those 3 days were agonizing. I went through my normal routines: work, kids' activities, household management, while wondering what Patricia was discovering in Boston. Was David meeting another woman? Was there some innocent explanation for everything I'd found? Would this finally prove I was either right to be suspicious or hopelessly paranoid, as everyone kept suggesting? Patricia called me on the evening of the 3rd day, asking to meet the next morning. I have my report ready. There are some things we need to discuss in person. I met her at the same coffee shop where we'd first met. Patricia pulled out a manila folder thick with photographs and printed documents. Your husband is not having an affair, she said directly, at least not in the traditional sense. He didn't meet any women during the 3 days I followed him. Relief flooded through me, mixed with confusion. Then what has he been doing? That's where it gets complicated, Patricia said, opening the folder. Your husband spent most of his time in Boston at various casinos and card rooms. He gambled for extensive periods: poker tables, blackjack, roulette. Based on what I observed and the research I did after following him, your husband appears to have a significant gambling problem. She showed me photographs of David at casino tables, his face showing the intense focus of someone deeply engaged in gambling. She showed me records from public databases indicating that David had been banned from 2 casinos in Atlantic City in the past year for suspected card counting or other prohibited behaviors. She showed me evidence that several of his business trips over the past 6 months had been to cities known primarily for their casinos: Las Vegas, Atlantic City, even a trip to Montreal, where the conference location happened to be next to a major casino. The cash withdrawals you noticed? Patricia continued. Those are typical of gambling addiction. Regular, large amounts of cash that leave no paper trail regarding where the money actually goes. The charges to local hotels? Those are likely from times he told you he was working late, but was actually at regional casinos and needed to stay overnight. But he's been mocking me for months for suspecting an affair, I said, still trying to process this information. He made me feel crazy. Gambling addicts often become very skilled at deception and deflection, Patricia explained. By redirecting your suspicions toward infidelity and then mocking those suspicions as paranoid, he kept you from looking at the actual problem. It's a classic misdirection strategy. What about the panties? The ones I found in his luggage and his jacket? Patricia shrugged. That I can't explain. It's possible they were exactly what he said, random mix-ups from hotels or conferences, or they could have been planted deliberately to reinforce the affair narrative that kept you from discovering the gambling. Some gambling addicts will create false evidence of affairs because that's easier to defend against than admitting to gambling problems. I sat there trying to absorb this information. My husband wasn't having an affair. He was a gambling addict. I didn't know which revelation was actually worse. There's more, Patricia said carefully. I did some additional research into your husband's financial situation, based on what you told me about unexplained cash withdrawals and charges. I have some contacts who can access certain information. What I found suggests your husband has accumulated significant debt. She showed me printouts from credit check databases that I didn't ask how she'd accessed. David had multiple credit cards I'd never known about, most of them maxed out with balances totaling over $80,000. He had personal loans from online lenders with predatory interest rates, totaling another $40,000. He had unpaid markers, essentially IOUs, from casinos totaling at least $25,000 based on what Patricia's sources could confirm. Your husband is likely at least $150,000 in debt, Patricia said. Possibly more depending on what other borrowing I couldn't uncover. This is serious financial danger for your family. I felt like I couldn't breathe. $150,000 in debt from gambling. While he'd been mocking me for being paranoid about panties that might have been deliberate misdirection. "What do I do?" I asked. "You need to consult with a divorce attorney immediately," Patricia said bluntly. "Even if you want to try to save your marriage, you need to protect yourself legally and financially. If your husband has been accumulating this debt without your knowledge, depending on your state's laws, you might be liable for some of it. You need to understand your legal position before confronting him." I took Patricia's advice. That same day, I called a divorce attorney whose name I'd gotten from a colleague who'd gone through a difficult separation. I met with her the following day, bringing all the documentation Patricia had provided plus the financial records I'd been keeping. The attorney, Helen Fitzgerald, was direct and practical. "First thing we need to do is understand the full scope of his debt and your legal liability. Then, we need to protect your assets and income from being used to cover gambling losses. New Jersey is an equitable distribution state, which means marital debt is divided fairly but not necessarily equally. However, if you can prove the debt was incurred through gambling without your knowledge or consent, you have a strong argument that it should be entirely his responsibility." Over the next week, working with Helen and a forensic accountant she recommended, I uncovered the true scope of David's financial deception. The gambling debt was actually closer to $200,000 when all sources were accounted for. He'd also forged my signature on a home equity line of credit, taking out $50,000 against our house without my knowledge. He'd cashed out most of his 401k early, incurring massive tax penalties that we'd be liable for. He'd even taken out a loan against his life insurance policy. The financial devastation was comprehensive. We were on the brink of losing our house. Our retirement savings were essentially gone. We owed tens of thousands in taxes, and David had been hiding all of this while mocking me for finding panties and questioning his fidelity. Helen helped me quietly protect my own assets. I opened a separate bank account and redirected my paycheck deposits there. I removed my name from joint credit cards. I gathered documentation of everything David had done without my knowledge or consent. And then, armed with all of this evidence, I finally confronted him. It was a Saturday morning. I'd sent the kids to my sister's house for the day, telling them we needed to have an important adult conversation. David was in the living room reading the newspaper, completely unaware of what I'd discovered. I placed the folder of evidence on the coffee table in front of him. Bank statements showing the withdrawals, casino photographs from Patricia's surveillance, credit reports showing the secret debt, documentation of the forged home equity loan, the full devastating scope of his gambling addiction and financial betrayal. "Explain all of this," I said calmly. David's face went through a rapid series of changes: confusion, recognition, panic, and finally resignation. Unlike his previous dismissals and mockery, he couldn't laugh this away or redirect blame to my paranoia. The evidence was too comprehensive and concrete. "How did you—" he started, then stopped. "You hired someone to follow me." "Yes. After you spent months making me feel crazy for suspecting something was wrong. After you mocked me in front of our friends and family. After you gaslit me into doubting my own perceptions. I stopped arguing with you and started gathering evidence instead." David put his head in his hands. "I have a problem. I know I have a problem." "You have a $200,000 problem," I said. "You've forged my signature on loans. You've drained our retirement savings. You've put our house at risk. You've lied to me for years while making me feel like I was the problem for suspecting anything was wrong." "I was trying to win it back," David said, the classic gambler's delusion. "Every time I lost, I thought if I just tried again I could recover the losses. It spiraled so fast, I didn't know how to stop or how to tell you. So instead you mocked me and made me feel paranoid when I found evidence that something was wrong. The panties? Were those deliberate?" "What? No. Those really were accidental, probably from hotel laundry or something. But when you found them and jumped to thinking I was having an affair, I realized that was actually better for me than you discovering the gambling. As long as you were looking for evidence of infidelity, you weren't looking at the finances. So you encouraged my suspicions about an affair while secretly draining our accounts and racking up massive debt." "I'm sorry," David said, and he was crying now. "I'm so sorry. I need help. I know I need help. You're right. You do need help. But that's no longer my problem." I pulled out the divorce papers Helen had already drafted. I'm filing for divorce. My attorney has already moved to separate our finances legally and to protect my income and assets from your gambling debt. I've documented everything you did without my knowledge or consent, including forging my signature, which is fraud. You're divorcing me? Just like that? After 14 years? Not just like that. After months of you lying, manipulating, mocking, and financially devastating our family while making me believe I was crazy for suspecting problems. After you chose gambling over our marriage, our children's security, and our future. After you forged my signature and committed fraud. Yes, I'm divorcing you. What about the kids? What am I supposed to tell them? You can tell them the truth for once, I said. Tell them their father has a gambling addiction that destroyed our family's financial security. Tell them you're getting help, but you don't get to lie to them the way you lied to me. David tried various tactics over the following days, begging for another chance, promising to get treatment, claiming I was abandoning him when he needed support for his addiction. But I was done. The man who'd mocked me for finding panties while secretly gambling away our future didn't deserve another chance. The divorce proceedings were complicated by the debt David had accumulated. Helen fought hard to ensure that debt was assigned entirely to David, rather than being split between us. We had strong arguments, the forged signatures, the secret accounts, the deliberate concealment. The judge ultimately ruled that David was responsible for approximately 85% of the gambling-related debt, with me liable for only about 15% that was in truly joint accounts. We had to sell the house to cover immediate debts and prevent foreclosure. I used my share of the proceeds plus my protected savings to buy a smaller house in a less expensive neighborhood. The kids adjusted to the new reality, angry at their father for the disruption, but resilient in the way children can be. David did eventually enter treatment for gambling addiction, though whether he's maintained recovery I don't know and no longer care. He has visitation with the kids every other weekend, supervised initially due to concerns about his stability, but now unsupervised. He pays child support, though less than he would have if he weren't drowning in debt repayment. The revelation about the gambling rather than an affair actually made the betrayal worse in some ways. An affair would have been about emotion or desire, comprehensible even if hurtful. But David had gambled away our children's security, our retirement, our future, and had done it while deliberately making me doubt my own sanity for suspecting problems. The mockery was what I couldn't forgive. The way he'd laughed at me for finding the panties. The way he'd told our friends and family that I was being paranoid and insecure. The way he'd weaponized my reasonable concerns into evidence of my unreasonable jealousy. All of it was deliberate strategy to keep me from discovering the gambling addiction he was hiding. I spent months in therapy processing the emotional abuse of that gaslighting. My therapist helped me understand that David's mockery was psychological manipulation, designed to make me doubt my perceptions and stop asking questions. It was a form of abuse, and recognizing that helped me let go of the guilt I'd carried about not trusting him. The social fallout was significant. When the truth came out, many of the people who'd sympathized with David about his paranoid wife had to confront their own role in enabling his deception. Some apologized. Others quietly distanced themselves, embarrassed about their judgment. I learned who my real friends were, the ones who acknowledged they'd been wrong and supported me through the divorce. My sister, who'd suggested I was creating drama in my marriage, was particularly mortified. "I can't believe I told you that you were imagining problems," she said. "You were right all along, and I made you doubt yourself." "David made me doubt myself," I corrected. "You just reinforced what he'd already convinced me, that my suspicions were my problem rather than his behavior. I should have listened to you instead of believing his version of events." "Yes," I agreed. "You should have." But David was very convincing, and he'd successfully established a narrative where I was the unreliable narrator of my own life. The experience taught me valuable lessons about trust, both trusting others and trusting myself. I learned that when someone consistently makes you doubt your own perceptions, that's a red flag for manipulation and potential abuse. I learned that mockery and dismissal are often tools used by people hiding things they don't want discovered. And I learned that my instincts, which had told me something was wrong despite having no concrete proof initially, were worth listening to even when everyone else told me I was wrong. It's been 3 years now since I found those first panties that David laughed off as paranoid jealousy. I'm 45, divorced, raising two teenagers largely on my own, and rebuilding financial security that was destroyed by David's addiction and deception. It's not the life I imagined when I married him at 28, full of hope and trust and belief in our future together. But it's an honest life. I'm not living in a web of lies and manipulation anymore. I'm not being mocked for reasonable concerns. I'm not doubting my own sanity because someone I trusted is deliberately making me question my perceptions. The bank records that finally revealed the truth were powerful because they were objective and undeniable. David could mock me and call me paranoid about panties found in his luggage, but he couldn't laugh away documented evidence of $200,000 in gambling debt and forged signatures on loan applications. The numbers didn't care about his narrative or his manipulation. They just told the truth. That's what I learned from this experience. Documentation matters. Evidence matters. When someone is gaslighting you and making you doubt yourself, objective proof becomes essential. Patricia's surveillance photographs, the bank statements, the credit reports, the loan applications with my forged signature, none of those things could be dismissed as my insecurity or paranoia. They were facts that forced everyone, including David, to confront reality. I wish I'd started documenting earlier instead of accepting David's mockery and trying to convince myself I was imagining problems. I wish I'd trusted my instincts when I found the first panties instead of letting him make me feel foolish for being suspicious. I wish I'd had the confidence to pursue the truth despite social pressure to just trust my husband and stop being jealous. But I also recognize that David was skilled at manipulation, that he'd created an effective system of deflection and mockery that made it nearly impossible to question him without seeming unreasonable. The gambling addiction had apparently been going on for years, possibly even before our marriage, and he'd developed sophisticated techniques for hiding it and redirecting suspicion. The panties themselves remain a mystery. Were they really innocent accidents, as David claimed, just random items that ended up in his belongings through hotel mix-ups? Or were they deliberately planted to create a false affair narrative that kept me looking in the wrong direction while he gambled away our future? I'll never know for certain, and it ultimately doesn't matter. They served their purpose. They made me suspicious, and that suspicion eventually led me to the truth, even though David tried to mock it away. What I want other people to understand from my story is that mockery and dismissal are often red flags for hidden problems. When someone responds to reasonable concerns with laughter and ridicule rather than reassurance and transparency, when they make you feel crazy for suspecting something feels wrong, when they weaponize your questions into evidence of your own inadequacy, those are signs that something is probably very wrong indeed. Trust your instincts even when everyone tells you you're paranoid. Document what you observe instead of arguing about it. Seek objective evidence instead of accepting subjective dismissals. And understand that people hiding serious problems often become very skilled at making you doubt yourself, so you'll stop looking for what they're concealing. David mocked me when I asked about the panties, turning my reasonable suspicions into a funny story about his jealous wife. He never expected that I'd stop confronting him directly and start investigating quietly. He never imagined I'd hire someone to follow him, or that I'd dig into financial records he'd kept hidden. He assumed his mockery would keep working, that I'd continue to doubt myself instead of pursuing the truth. But I stopped caring about looking paranoid and started caring about finding facts. And when the bank records finally appeared, documenting years of gambling losses and secret debt and forged loans, the truth spoke so much louder than any amount of mockery ever could. That's the real lesson from my experience. The truth is powerful when it's documented and proven. Mockery only works as long as there's ambiguity and uncertainty. Once you have objective evidence, the mockery becomes irrelevant, and the person who is laughing at your suspicions finds themselves confronting undeniable reality. David's confidence crumbled when faced with bank statements and surveillance photos and credit reports. All his clever deflections and dismissive laughter meant nothing compared to documented proof of what he'd actually been doing. And all the social pressure that had made me doubt myself evaporated when I could show people concrete evidence rather than just expressing vague concerns. I'm grateful to Patricia, the investigator, and Helen, the attorney, and the forensic accountant, and everyone else who helped me uncover and document the truth. But I'm most grateful to my own instincts that kept insisting something was wrong, despite months of being told I was imagining things. Those instincts saved me by refusing to accept David's narrative, even when it would have been easier to just believe him and stop questioning. If you're in a situation where someone is making you feel crazy for suspecting problems, where reasonable questions are met with mockery and dismissal, where you're being told your perceptions are the issue rather than someone else's behavior, trust yourself. Document what you observe. Seek objective evidence. And understand that people who have nothing to hide don't need to make you feel crazy for asking questions. The panties were just the beginning. The mockery was the misdirection. But the bank records were the truth. And in the end, the truth always speaks louder than any amount of laughter or dismissal or deliberate gaslighting designed to make you doubt what you know in your gut to be true. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been gaslit or mocked for suspecting the truth, smash that like button and subscribe. Share with someone who needs to trust their instincts. Comment about a time you were right, despite everyone telling you were wrong. Remember that mockery is often misdirection, that your perceptions matter, and that documented truth is more powerful than any amount of dismissive laughter.